The world is full of threats and dangers. Without the proper weapons to protect yourself, you may find yourself at the game over screen. But surfing the internet, at least, can be safe and secure when you use NordVPN. NordVPN is a virtual private network that shields your internet connection from prying eyes, while also speeding up your broadband connection and making it more secure. It's quick and easy to use, so you don't have to be a tech whiz to set it up. And once you've got it going, it keeps your data, from your search history to your IP address to your more questionable downloads, completely private. It also has plenty of other benefits. Want to watch a show on Netflix that isn't available in your region? Simply switch your location to another region and find what you're looking for. For me, as a big fan of Japanese media, I like using my VPN to gain access to Japan Netflix, where I can watch dramas like Cherry Magic and Samurai Cat. You can use NordVPN on up to 6 devices, which means it's easy to switch from your PC to your mobile device and still keep your connection safe. Right now, NordVPN is offering a fantastic deal. Sign up for the 2-year plan and you'll get 4 bonus months on top. It's risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. And not only will you be helping yourself by securing your internet access, you'll be helping support the channel by supporting our sponsors. Thanks to NordVPN for the sponsorship, and thank you for watching. Enjoy the video. When we talk about abusive behaviors and how people harm others, we often couch it in the language of gender, because how we are raised, how we are socialized to behave, often affects how we cause harm in others. It is by no means the only way people can hurt one another, but it is a pattern that appears again and again in societies built like ours, America and Japan, both heavily bound by gendered roles and restrictions, and both of them cultures that have had a massive influence on the series of Silent Hill. How does this influence manifest in the games, and what kind of gendered violence is at the heart of the story? Let's consider the first Silent Hill game. Masculine societies would have main characters who are always tough, who run in guns blazing. Harry is not that. He's a writer, a role associated with the intellectual that tradition would call emasculated. And he's not violent. He's a single father, a caretaker having to play both parental roles, and he cares about the people he meets, attempting to save all of them, regardless of their own personal motives. He's a good man, a moral man, and he's so traditionally feminine, the director of the Silent Hill movie changed his gender because he felt Harry was not a man. The first game was centered upon themes of birth and impregnation forced upon a child by her mother. The violence we see is primarily mother against daughter, both in terms of the terrible things Dahlia says to and about her child, and the things she forces Alessa to undergo. Harry attempts to intervene and save both girls from a terrible fate, and ultimately ends the story, in the canon ending, with a child returning to the role of caretaker. It is a story in which he fails. He cannot save Cheryl, cannot save Sybil, the town, or anyone. The true horror of Silent Hill comes from considering the world these characters live in, a society that has become so entangled with violence and darkness it is nearly impossible for anyone to survive. Monsters in this series embody the feelings and traumas of those at the center of the story, and often these traumas are either related to the damage done by a man to a female character, such as Angela and her father, or the traumas a man has about female characters, such as Walter and mother figures. There are other characters with different traumas, like Eddie and his male bullies, but we don't see any monsters related to his past like we do James and Angela. The early games create a trend, which later games followed. This makes male-on-female violence the central focus of the monsters, It might make you think that's the focus of the whole story. But when you look closer, the opposite is true. There are two layers to the heart of Silent Hill's discussion about violence. The first is the societal one, which is reflected in our personal relationships with the society we live in and the people we live with. Angela is beaten and abused by her relatives, and leaving home doesn't make things better. Her coworkers and workplace make her unhappy and uncomfortable. It's the combination of both that creates the overwhelming trauma at the heart of a character. In Angela's case, her hatred and fear of men. The second layer is the relationship between the protagonist and the antagonist. It's easy to forget since most of the games focus on side characters and monsters. We rarely see the main character actually meet their antagonists. But once you consider them in this light, it becomes clear the violence between them is characterized differently. Masculine violence is considered primarily to be physical, to be pain and punishment, emotional repression, toxicity that encourages self-loathing, and misogyny, because the feminine is emotional and emotions are weak. Feminine violence is considered primarily to be emotional and verbal. The manipulator, the gaslighter, the liar and abuser who twists words into weapons and demeans others, destroying their self-confidence and independence. Every villain in Silent Hill is a feminine abuser, each of them more heavily associated with the pain of words and manipulations than physical attacks or emotional repression. They use emotions as their weapon to trick others into acting against their own interests. The first and best example of this is Dahlia, who lies and tricks Harry into working with her, keeping secrets and speaking mysteriously to mislead him. We see her use the same technique on her daughter in the past, when she tells Alessa she's found a way for them to be together. Silent Hill 3 is the most fascinating example of this feminine villain because it presents us with two antagonists, or semi-antagonists, male and female, who both use feminine means of violence against the main character. This violence not only hurts Heather, it destroys both the antagonists, Vincent and Claudia. And it presents both of them as victims themselves, comparing their childhoods growing up with people like Leonard, Claudia's father, against Heather's childhood with her father, Harry. Heather does not kill either Vincent or Claudia. Claudia betrays Vincent, stabbing him, and then causes her own death by swallowing the god fetus. Essentially, they both destroy themselves. Vincent, believing in his own superiority to the end, should probably not have turned his back to the crazy woman with the knife. Claudia does not physically intimidate or attack Heather. She meets Heather multiple times and only speaks to her, often in purposefully confusing ways. Her physical behavior is not in any way imposing. She stands far away at a distance. She does not invade Heather's space or speak angrily or loudly. She is quiet, demure, distant, all physically safe behaviors. Yet she causes harm by the secrets she keeps, the way she manipulates Heather into doing her will, and she does so entirely with words. When she does take action, it is through commanding others, not through harming the girl herself. Claudia never raises a hand to Heather. She does not force her to return to Silent Hill, does not force her to follow her. It is entirely manipulation. Vincent, meanwhile, acts as if he is on Heather's side, and he sort of is, all the while keeping the fact he's a member of the Order to himself. He doesn't warn Heather about Claudia's planned attack on Heather's father, though he must know of it, and he doesn't explain what's happening or why. In fact, he takes pleasure from Heather's confusion and pain and worsens those feelings by lying and misleading her. The scene in which he implies the monsters might be human is the most obvious scene, a moment in which, using only his words, Vincent deals one of the heaviest blows to Heather's psyche. He also does not behave in a physically violent way. In fact, Heather has more of the masculine behaviors than he does. When she hears Vincent talking poorly of Harry, she slams her fist against the wall and steps forward angrily, a promise of physical violence. And it is Vincent who backs away. He, meanwhile, keeps distant from her, allowing her to stay on the opposite side of the room to him, never trying to come too close. Neither Vincent or Claudia are physically violent or abusive themselves, yet they grew up under a man who was. Vincent implies it during dialogue, and given the history of the cult and behavior of its many characters, it seems absolutely obvious Leonard, Claudia's father, would be physically abusive. Moreover, he's an actual boss in the game, transformed into a monster himself, a looming, towering man who attacks by swinging his arms wildly. He's turned into a gross parody of who he must have been to young Claudia, a looming monstrosity who offered only pain. Yet for all that Claudia is not like her father, she's not better than him. She has been twisted and transformed by him, and is continuing the cycle of violence he began. She herself admits the paradise she hopes to create would have no room for someone like her. Yet she can't see how far from heaven she's fallen, because she cannot see how the world she's creating is the same hell she lived in as a child, one where everyone suffers, and through universal suffering, we cease to cause each other suffering. She invalidates her own argument. She and Vincent are perfect examples of how years of pain only leads to more pain. The puzzles of Silent Hill 3 reinforce the idea behind these gendered themes. Consider the Marchen puzzle, which involves finding two missing pieces of two different fairy tales. The location's name is a hint at the fairy tale's origins. It's a German word, and the German versions of these tales are far darker than their Disney counterpoints. Moreover, both stories, Cinderella and Snow White, are fairy tales in which the heroes and the villains are both women, and the central actions and drives of the characters are heavily associated with femininity, marriage, beauty, jealousy, gossip. The villains' actions are carried out via words. Both stories also happen to involve blood and shoes. In the German Cinderella, the stepsisters cut off their toes in an attempt to fit into the glass slipper. In Snow White, the evil queen is sentenced to wear a pair of enchanted shoes that force her to dance until death. The gendered roles do not imply that gendered male or female is the enemy. It is the culture of violence which poisons gender and makes it impossible to tell friend from foe. Douglas is Heather's ally, but because he is a strange man she doesn't know, she cannot in any way trust him. This culture of violence won't allow it. The risk is too great. If she had, things might have been different. The possibility is there. If she had asked him to return home with her to speak to her father, perhaps they would have arrived before Claudia. Because she was forced to treat him as a possible threat, she was trapped in the mall for far too long. Vincent is also a possible enemy, and he doesn't help when his own behavior is so suspect. Yet he too is technically an ally. The men are not the problem, it's the culture that destroys them, that transforms the masculine and feminine ideals into poisons that rot people from the inside. We see the opposite, the feminine violence, in the forced impregnations, the motherhood which is turned into a weapon, the womb which refuses to let go of its child. Dahlia suffocates and controls her child to her own ruin, forcibly impregnates her as another method of control. And Claudia does the same exact thing to Heather. Both times, the actor in the use of impregnation to control is a woman, and the theme of femininity as a means of control runs throughout Silent Hill. The true revelation at the heart of Silent Hill is one of moderation, because the best of its characters are those who embody both the male and female ideals. Consider Harry, who is so traditionally feminine he became a woman, and Heather, a female protagonist who behaves far more violently and masculine than many others like her. Both characters could be described as having most of the traits of their traditional opposites, because they are healthy, well-rounded people who grew up in normal families and not a cult run by violence and oppression. Heather is allowed to be emotional and cutesy, calling her father daddy, but she's also physically active and tough, and she's everything in between. Her father, Harry, is an action hero who runs through half of Silent Hill to save his daughter, and he takes the time to care for strangers he meets, to try and help others, to be emotional and share his feelings rather than repress them. The true secret to happiness not trying to adhere to the ideal, male or female. Let's consider some of the patterns of violence in the rest of the series. First, there's Silent Hill 4, a game in which the main antagonist appears throughout, and yet does not become physically violent until much later. He meets Henry and speaks to him normally, even offers him a gift. Later, when he does attack, he is not angry and menacing like a traditional masculine villain. He is the reserved, unemotional, and distant young man he was before. Even in the final cutscene, he has none of the outward mannerisms of a masculine villain. It is the softness of a feminine villain, telling Henry that he's it, the last sacrifice, as if he's not discussing violently murdering the man, as if he isn't implying Eileen is already dead. Most of the actual physical violence of Walter happens off-screen or in a cutscene to someone else. He is at a distance from the pain he creates. We see the aftermath of his actions against various victims. We see him brutalize a female monster. He chases us through the woods. But the physical violence is balanced by that emotional and sometimes literal physical distance from the violence caused. He is not entirely a figure to fear because of his physical presence. Rather, he's almost like a ghost who happens to be near when terrible things occur. Behind him is the specter of his mother, who he is trying to bring back. And behind her, the woman who put the idea in his head in the first place, the original manipulator, Dahlia. Motherhood and control are central to the game's themes. Backstory lore implies Voltiel was entered into Walter's psyche to help guide him, and the boy was raised and indoctrinated by the cult, quite literally controlled by a mother figure, Dahlia, who uses the idea of his mother to control him. Layers upon layers of violence. Silent Hill Origins is another fascinating example of male and female traditions of violence. The story is heavily focused on Alessa's past, but Travis Grady also plays a prominent role, as does his role with his mother and the parallels between him and Alessa. Both were young children whose mothers attempted to kill them or cause them terrible harm, and that violence leaves a mark. His father is distant and eventually kills himself, another terrible discovery for the young boy, but the only one to cause him physical harm, not emotional, is his mother. The woman returns as a monster, a female figure trapped in a translucent bell, bringing to mind the imagery associated with the bell jar, a famous novel discussing female mental illness and suicide. Silent Hill Downpour comes at these themes with a touch of a switcheroo. There's two main antagonists, one of whom is never really on camera. The first is Anne, the police officer, who is definitely a masculine variation on the theme of violence. She's quite literally a cop. She wields a weapon and aims it at Murphy multiple times, even forcing him to his knees at gunpoint. She threatens his life and his safety, verbally abuses and intimidates him, and is certainly a horrible reminder of what he must have faced at the prison every day. The other villain is a mere memory in comparison. Sewell, the police officer whose actions led to Murphy's downfall. He appears in multiple memories in the game, but not once is he there in real time, after Murphy leaves the prison. It's an incredible and horrible realization the further in the game you go, that the monster behind so much violence in this story is already out of our reach, and we will never have our reconciliation. He is the feminine instigator of violence. He manipulates with words, he lies and cajoles. He's friendly and nice one moment, only to be cruel and dismissive once he has what he wants. Save for that scene in the showers, Sewell never has to be physically violent to get what he wants. He has others do it for him, never telling them his real motivations or desires. The stories of Silent Hill are incredibly layered and complex, and deal with concepts that are deeply personal and profound. It's no wonder that decades later we're still digging into them and finding new meaning, and considering the series over this summer with Silent Hill 3's anniversary just passing us by, I couldn't help but be awed by the level of detail built into these games, and how delicately they handle complex themes in unique ways. While masculine violence and physical abuse is always a major threat in its world, neither are feminine themes of violence and verbal abuse forgotten or overlooked. The story of each game has both variations woven into one another, depicting how a twisted world creates twisted people who can only cause more pain and suffering.